Hello, good people of YouTube. Mountbatten here, and today we are discussing a ship that I'm pretty sure I haven't done a standalone video on since it came out, what, 6-7 years ago? So it's been a minute since we've discussed the Tier 9 tech line French battleship, the Alsace, which, in my humble opinion, is one of the better, if not one of the best Tier 9 tech line battleships in-game, and she has aged incredibly well, which is saying something considering all the nonsense that has been added to the game and all the changes that have occurred since this thing came out in, I think, like January 2018, December 2017. Like I said, she's been out for a minute. But what is an Alsace? Why would you maybe want to grind up to it? And what does make it so good in 2025? We're going to be answering all that and more in today's video. But right now, if you don't mind going down and hitting that like button and that subscribe button, or waiting until you decide if you do actually like the video or not, I just ask that you push those two buttons before you leave for the day, because the YouTube algorithm loves seeing those two buttons pushed. And while you're down there, why not leave a comment as well? Again, we must appease the algorithm here on YouTube, but with that cringe out of the way, let us begin. So, the Alsace is a interesting, odd, and yet also kind of sensical sequel to the Richelieu, in that the Richelieu gives you 2 turrets with 4 guns per turret, and the Alsace is essentially a bigger Richelieu with another turret slapped onto the back. So it's like, okay, the French were starting to see sense and gave their new battleship a more traditional layout. And I do believe this was an actual real design for the French Navy. So, okay, cool. Now we have 12 guns on a Tier 9 battleship, which that in and of itself is pretty wild. If you look at most other Tier 9 tech line battleships, at least, you'll see that they tend to all have the more or less standard configuration of, 2 turrets in the front, 1 in the back. Of course, you have your outliers there like the Ismo, right? But they all generally have, 9-ish guns, and here you are with 12. We wouldn't see, gun numbers this high until we saw the Lepanto added all those years later. So that's pretty good. And they are 15-inch guns. You might be thinking, Sealord, 15-inch guns at Tier 9 aren't that large. And you're not wrong. Even back when the Alsace was introduced, 15-inch guns at Tier 9 were indeed not that large, let alone today, again, with all the nonsense we have at Tier 9 nowadays. So they are definitely small by today's standards, for sure, when it comes to main battery guns on your Tier 9 battleship. But these guns have quite a bit in store for you, a little bit more than you might think. Now, the guns on the on the Alsace are very French, in that they have a high initial velocity. The accuracy isn't overly fantastic by any standards, and, well, they can be a little silly at times when it comes to what they like to do with their RNG, but they do hit hard with the AP, and the HE is actually quite usable, which is very rare for a tech line battleship, or really any battleship in-game. Most battleships in-game, you're really meant to use one of the 2 ammo types, like the Soviets, for example. Their AP is insane with all the, special ballistics and such that the AP shells get, and the HE is just kind of there. Sure, you can use it, but it's not overly special, and you should probably be using the AP anyway because of how good the AP shells are on those Soviet battleships. But with the Alsace, you can make great use of the AP or the HE, and in fact, it's one of the few battleships in-game that you will be constantly swapping back and forth between those 2 munition types throughout the game. Again, compared to most other battleships where you just keep the AP loaded, or the SAP loaded if you're the Italians, and then the only time you really swap on over to HE is when there's really nothing but destroyers left on your flank. But the Alsace, at least the way that I play it and that I have the most success with it, I usually start off with the HE, and then as the game progresses, I get a little bit closer, then I swap on over to the AP. You can, again, use either munition throughout the match, and it will work. Why? Well, the HE will work quite simply because you have 12 guns at Tier 9. And with the build that I'm running on my Alsace, which does not include the fire flags or anything to really buff the fire percentage, you have a 36% chance of starting a fire per shell, and you have 12 shells being slung at the enemy ship every, again depending upon your build, every 28.2 seconds with the reload module on the Alsace. So that, quite frankly, is a lot of HE going downrange pretty consistently throughout the match. And keep in mind, too, that 28.2 seconds with the module, that's before you factor in, adrenaline rush, which we'll get to that here in a second with how the Alsace takes damage, but your reload time will be quite low, quite fast. So you're slinging so much HE downrange, you are going to be starting fires. And now do keep in mind too, it is also 15-inch HE. There's not really too many ships that can, tank that, because you have 63 millimeters of pin. So you're going to be doing pin damage, and it's HE, doesn't really matter where it hits, it's probably going to pin, unless it's like the main belt, right? So you're pinning the enemy ship, you're setting fires to the enemy ship, it's fantastic. Mainly because the accuracy at range with the Alsace isn't overly fantastic, and her accuracy through and through isn't overly fantastic either, which we'll get to that here in a second when we get to the AP. But again, with the HE, doesn't matter. You hit the superstructure, you hit the bow, the deck, whatever. You just got to hit the ship, and you have a chance of doing fire damage. And again, with throwing 12 shells downrange every 28.2 seconds, you're going to be doing that. So that's usually how I like to open up my matches with the Alsace. Unless I see like a beautiful broadside, I just keep HE loaded, burn stuff down at first. Now the AP, on the other hand, is very nice. It's the French AP. When it connects, it hurts like hell, has great penetration, and it is screaming out of the barrels at 830 meters a second. Same with the HE. And with that high velocity, and at least initial velocity, it's not that difficult to land. Well, not that difficult to get your aim right. Again, you're a little bit more in RNG's boat once you fire the shells, but the shells will probably land where you'd expect them to land in terms of like your guesstimations, your lead, and your elevation. But again, how many of them will actually hit? That's kind of up to RNG, especially at range. But the dispersion is definitely good enough to where once you're at more middle-ish ranges, the AP shells will be hitting more often than missing. In most cases. Again, RNG is still going to step in and do really goofy things with your shells from time to time. But definitely from like 13, 14 kilometers in, it's more than accurate enough to, when you see, a target that you can take advantage of your AP with, they're going to connect and it's going to do damage. Now, the shells are so friggin' good at pinning, you will be overpinning a lot of things with the Alsace. It is one of the big downsides of the AP on the Alsace. When you see like, cruisers and such for middle range, when you can actually get your AP shells on target, a lot of cases you are going to overpin them. More so than, other 15-inch guns at tier 9 because of how fast they're moving. But that can, of course, be mitigated by, shortening your shots a little bit, aiming a little bit below where that hull meets the water line and getting your shells to hit the water first, slow down, then they'll be going slow enough to penetrate the cruiser's citadel at that point. So you can mitigate some of it by doing that. But if you aim, right at the belt armor, you're probably going to overpin most cruisers, even heavy cruisers, right? And some battleships too, with how thin some battle cruisers armor is in today's World of Warships. But most other chunky targets, most tier 10, tier 9 and above battleships, like you catch their side, you're going to absolutely obliterate them with 12, 15-inch shells moving this fast at mid to close range. So it's pretty nice when that happens. Now combine that with, well, the hull of the Alsace. The ship itself is very nice. Not even talking about the guns. It's a very fast tier 9 battleship because you do have the French engine boost to work with, which will get you going with the speed flat up and over 34. I think it tops at like 35 knots. Of course, you could do things like take brisks to make the ship that much faster. I wouldn't really recommend that, but you can if you really want a fast Alsace. But yeah, and with that engine boost going, the ship really almost feels more like a very large heavy cruiser than a battleship. It's like almost there to that point of like, you know how like the St. Vincent feels when you're running the engine boost in the St. Vincent. It's like almost to that point of maneuverability and speed, but of course not quite there. So it's a great tool to use when you need to, you know, zip on down a flank, find some broadsides, or you need to retreat. It's wonderful for that, and the engine boost really does, you know, elevate the Alsace to that next level when you are using it. But even without the engine boost, the ship is fairly maneuverable. You get again, this is without a module into the rudder. You get a 16-second rudder shift time. You have a 9 to 10 meter turning circle radius, which is really weird. Doesn't really feel that big when you're playing it, but I guess it is because it says it is. But the other downside of the Alsace is that, well, it is a French battleship, which means it is absolutely coated in 32 millimeters of armor everywhere. Bow, side plating, stern. Now, obviously, the armor belt isn't that thin. It has a 350 millimeter armor belt, but the torpedo protection on top of that is 32 millimeters, which is it's something. Because, you know, every destroyer, every cruiser, and their mom at tier 9 and above, they're trying to get their HE to pin 32 millimeters of armor. You know, they'll take IFHE all day to get over that threshold, because that's the last common threshold in game. That means when their HE shells merely touch your ship, they're going to be doing damage. So that is definitely a downside of the Alsace. Funny things can happen with the armor, because it's the French armor. It's not quite as funny as like the French cruisers, like the Henry line, where you'll hit them with like an 18-inch shell and like they don't care. But, you know, with, you know, some of those torpedo bulges and stuff, some funny things can happen there. So you do have to contend with that. Now, of course, when you're coming up against AP, you do need 18-inch guns to overmatch it. So again, there is some goofiness that can happen there, but the amount of HE spam that you're going to be coming under, you know, all the bombs and such, like nowadays, like the Dutch airstrikes, they absolutely rip HP out of your Alsace. However, again, it's fast when you got the engine boost going and maneuverable, so you should be able to kind of dance around that. Secondaries are another thing that players feel very strongly about with the Alsace for some reason. Like, yes, the secondaries, especially like early versions of the Alsace and testing, the secondaries were kind of cracked, but Wargaming has booped the secondaries with the Nerf hammer several times. Now to the point where they are something, and even in the match you're watching in the background, I do not have a secondary build on this Alsace. Nary a secondary skill, nary a secondary module has been slapped onto the Alsace, but I managed to get 2 secondary kills. Because the secondaries are, well, the gunners are quite simply on meth with the reload time. Again, without a single skill, you have a 2.8 second reload time on her 100mm secondary guns, and you get 24 of these 100mm secondary guns. So there's a lot of them. They reload really fast. You have an 8.8 kilometer range. I do believe I do have the flag on, however, so there is that. Yes, I do have the flag on. So you are just spewing out secondary shells, and they do have a 5% fire chance, which is pretty dang nice. However, in my experience with the Alsace, which is a fair amount, the secondaries just kind of get obliterated by any amount of HE, which is going to be getting thrown at you because, again, your Alsace is coated in 32 millimeters of armor. So your secondaries don't really survive that long in the game. And because of that, they're not really worth building into, in my opinion, because once you really get in there and get to that mid-range and start eating all this, you know, HE and AP shells, most of your secondaries are going to be broken, so it's not really worth building into. And they only pin 17 millimeters of armor. The vast majority of them, those 100mm secondaries, only pin 17 millimeters of armor. Now, the 152 millimeter secondary guns, which are the big tri-turrets that you see, those can pin 25 millimeters of armor, and that is obviously much more effective at dealing with, you know, cruisers and such, as you'll see in the background footage here. So those are pretty good, but you don't really get too many of them. You get, what, 3 turrets of those 152 millimeter guns? Yeah, you only get 9 of them. So, yeah, 3 turrets, 3 guns per turret. You only get 9 of those 152s. So, yeah, unfortunately, that's, you know, if you feel like your secondary Alsace is working, I'm really glad. I wouldn't really recommend building into it because, this build kind of works better for me. So, what that gives you is a fast Tier 9 battleship with rapid firing guns, 28 seconds on 12 guns at Tier 9. It's pretty crazy. You've got the ability to use HE quite effectively and the ability to use AP quite effectively as well. So, what that gives you is the ability to stay at longer ranges in the opening bits of the game. And keep in mind, even with the reload module, my guns have a range of 20.3 kilometers, which is definitely workable given the concealment of the Alsace. 13.2 kilometers with the commander and module skill. That's pretty good for a ship this fast and this mean. So because of that, you can easily, use your HE in the opening matches, go dark when you need to, use your speed boost to engage and disengage when you need to. And then once the game evolves on to where, like half of both teams are dead, you can then push in and use that sweet French AP to its effectiveness against those battleships and those heavier cruisers, or even, again, light cruisers if you short your shots. And the 15-inch guns, keep in mind, they can overmatch a lot of light cruisers that you run into, so you can simply pop them in the nose, and given how crazy these shells are, you're probably going to delete most of their HP through the nose, so that's pretty nice. But yeah, you move in with your AP, with your fast and maneuverable battleship, with hopefully most of your health intact from the earlier stages of the game, and you just tear everything apart. It's a really satisfying way to play, and she's really friggin' good at it. And you might be thinking, well, there's torpedoes and submarines and such at close range. You don't care because when you have your speed boost going, the ship is crazy maneuverable. So submarine torpedoes, if your speed boost is going, you just don't care because you can either, well, you can't outrun them. She's not quite that fast, but obviously with the 2 kilometer disengagement range of the homing on battleships and the speed boost, you can outmaneuver them fairly well. I believe I do that in this match, maybe, but it's something that can very much be done. So she's great for that. And above all else, she's fun to play. This is a really fun play style in the Alsace, for me at least. And keep in mind, too, after the Alsace, you've got the Republic, which is a fantastic Tier 10 tech line battleship. She's in the A category in my Ultimate Battleship tier list video because, well, she is a ship that firmly deserves to be in that A ranking in the Ultimate Battleship tier list. So you've got a fantastic Tier 9, and then you have an even better Tier 10 with the Republic waiting for you. And keep in mind, too, in 2025, we have a lot more battle cruisers now, so there's actually even more ships that the Alsace can bully now at Tier 10 because of all the battle cruisers with the thinner armor that have been added to the game. Yeah, the Dutch cruisers do kind of, suck when you have to deal with them, but again, with the maneuverability and speed of the Alsace, they're not too much to contend to. And like I said, submarines too, in most cases, it's more than maneuverable enough to deal with a submarine. Of course, a good submarine commander will catch you with your pants down, and that's what submarines are all about. But yeah, this is a ship that she's great at kiting. She's great at popping up from 13 kilometers undetected and blapping, enemy ships' broadsides with her speed boost. You find an opening on a flank, run down it, find the enemy battleships with their pants down, and just blast them. That's one of the funnest things with the Alsace and with, the Bourgogne by extension, which is a turbocharged Alsace. And that's usually what I've been saying about the Alsace for the past 3 years, is just mentioning it and passing with the Bourgogne. But yeah, I felt like she deserved a look back in today's video because she is such a fun and good tech line ship, and I highly encourage you guys to grind up the French battleship line. There's a little bit of goofiness leading up to her with how the French were building their battleships, but once you get to the Alsace, you've got a really, really good ship on your hands. So guys, that is my look back at the Alsace in 2025. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and all of that jazz. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.